The velvet boxes were stacked perfectly on his dark oak desk. Inside were the diamonds, the platinum cards, the keys to the estate. I didn't take a single cent. I just took a deep breath of the cold morning air, walked out the front gates, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt rich. But that profound, absolute peace did not arrive effortlessly. It was paid for in months of isolation, and the final cost was tallied exactly 24 hours earlier, at the far end of a 20-foot mahogany dining table. Dinner at the Vance estate was never a shared meal. It was a scheduled autopsy of the day. The vast room smelled consistently of polished wood, bitter lemon wax, and the faint, metallic scent of chilled silver. The ceiling was impossibly high, painted with a faded fresco that swallowed whatever ambient noise dared to exist, leaving only the sharp, isolating clink of a heavy silver fork against bone china. At one end of the mahogany expanse sat my husband, Arthur Vance. He was a man carved from winter stone and dark steel, a man who had been raised to believe that emotion was a dangerous liability, and that financial provision was the absolute ceiling of human devotion. He didn't read poetry. He read market ledgers and legal briefs. He didn't offer comfort. He drafted highly efficient solutions to mitigate discomfort. At the other end of the table, separated by 20 feet of polished wood, and a floral arrangement of white lilies so flawless it looked entirely synthetic, sat me, Clara Harlow, or, as the society papers preferred to politely imply, the physical collateral for a dead man's failures. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. When my father, David Harlow, passed away, the sheer weight of a life that had spiraled utterly out of control fell onto my shoulders in a crushing wave of collection notices and foreclosure threats. Arthur had simply stepped in. He had paid the debts in a single clinical wire transfer, erasing the terror of bankruptcy overnight, and in exchange, he presented a marriage contract. He required a quiet, respectable wife to stabilize his public image ahead of a massive corporate merger. I required a lifeline to keep a roof over my head. It was a transaction. I knew that. I had signed my name on the dotted line with a steady hand. But over the course of 36 months, a quiet, foolish part of my heart had still hoped to find a human being beneath his tailored Italian suits. I had hoped that, eventually, the transaction would thaw into a partnership. That frail hope died quietly on a Tuesday evening. I had spent the afternoon sitting in the sterile white solarium, watching the coastal Massachusetts rain batter, the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The estate was so large that you could scream in the west wing and not a single soul in the east wing would hear you. A profound, suffocating isolation had pressed down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. The tears had come silently. They slipped down my face not in messy sobs but in a slow, steady leak of absolute exhaustion. I hadn't made a sound. I had just sat there, clutching a cold cup of tea, letting the grief of my unlived life wash over me. Or so I thought. Now at the dinner table, the heavy oak doors swung open with a quiet whoosh of displaced air. Julius Thorne stepped into the room. Julius was Arthur's personal lawyer and loyal assistant. He moved like a shadow, his footsteps barely registering on the cold, checkerboard marble floor. He possessed the terrifying efficiency of a man who could dismantle a rival corporation or arrange a private funeral without ever changing his resting heart rate. He was the grim reaper of emotional connection, the man Arthur sent to handle anything that couldn't be neatly quantified in a spreadsheet. Julius approached my end of the table, his expression completely unreadable, and placed a dark blue velvet box perfectly parallel to my crystal water glass. I stared at it. The velvet absorbed the low ambient light of the room, looking like a void against the crisp white tablecloth. Arthur did not look up from the digital tablet resting beside his plate. He sliced a piece of rare steak, his movements precise and mechanical. "For you," Arthur said. His voice was a low, gravelly hum that resonated in the hollow space of the room. It was a voice that commanded boardrooms. A voice that never had to repeat itself. I hesitated, my fingers trembling slightly as I reached for the brass clasp of the box. I snapped it open. Resting on a bed of tight white satin was a blue diamond necklace. The stones were massive, flawless, and terrifyingly cold. They caught the light and fractured it into sharp, icy splinters. It was a piece of jewelry that belonged behind bulletproof glass, in a museum vault, not resting against the fragile warmth of a human collarbone. It was worth more than the entirety of my father's accumulated debt. It was a staggering fortune, held within the confines of a small hinged box. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice sounding terribly small and fragile in the cavernous room. Arthur finally looked up. His eyes were the color of a winter ocean. Gray, flat, and impenetrable. He set his silver knife down on the rim of his plate. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating, before he offered the explanation that would permanently sever whatever fragile thread still tied me to his world. "I heard you cry this afternoon," Arthur said. His tone was entirely devoid of malice, which somehow made the words infinitely worse. I didn't like it. He didn't ask why I was crying. He didn't push back his heavy chair, cross the 20 feet of mahogany, and reach out to touch my hand. He didn't offer a shoulder or even sit beside me in the quiet to share the burden of the silence. To Arthur Vance, tears were not a sign of emotional distress. They were an auditory nuisance. He had simply identified a problem, my sadness, and authorized Julius to purchase a high-yield solution to make it stop. The blue diamonds were a mute button. They were a transaction designed to buy my silence, to ensure that the curated perfection of his estate remained undisturbed by something as messy as human grief. I looked down at the necklace. I didn't throw it across the room. I didn't stand up and scream that I was suffocating. I didn't perform any of the loud, melodramatic tantrums that people use to demand their worth. Instead, I sat perfectly still, pulling my defensive armor tightly around my chest. I lowered my gaze to the stones, mentally tracing their harsh geometry. I silently counted the exact number of facets on the center blue diamond. 1, 2, 3, 4. I focused entirely on the microscopic cuts of the stone, the way human hands had violently carved away its natural shape, until it reflected only cold, calculated light. I counted them to keep my breathing steady. I counted them to keep my dignity intact. I realized with a quiet, devastating clarity that this was exactly how Arthur viewed me. I was a rough stone he had purchased, a piece of raw material he was trying to carve down into a perfectly compliant, reflective surface. He didn't want the raw edges of my grief. He didn't want the unpolished reality of my humanity. He only wanted the shine. I expect unquestioning obedience in exchange for my generosity. Arthur had told me on our wedding day, outlining his expectation of a flawless, unproblematic existence. He had bought my compliance, and he expected a return on his investment. Not because he was intentionally cruel, but because he literally did not possess the vocabulary for emotional vulnerability. I closed the velvet box with a soft, definitive click. The sound echoed sharply off the high walls. "Thank you, Arthur," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and chillingly polite. "It is very beautiful." Julius Thorne gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod of approval, taking my composure as a sign of successful pacification, before retreating back into the shadows of the hallway. Arthur returned his attention to his tablet, satisfied that the transaction had concluded. The glitch in his domestic system had been resolved. I picked up my fork and resumed eating. I chewed, I swallowed, and I breathed the lemon-scented air. But inside, I was already gone. My departure was already written in the quiet spaces between the ticking of the antique grandfather clock. I would not allow myself to be commodified any longer. I refused to exist as a porcelain doll in a mausoleum of wealth. The storm passed during the early hours of the night, leaving the morning sky a pale, washed-out shade of gray. Arthur left the estate at exactly 6:30, as he always did, his Blacktown car sliding silently down the long, winding gravel driveway. The house immediately settled into its usual, oppressive stillness. No music, no vows, just silence. I stood in the center of the master bedroom, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. The space was enormous, decorated in clinical shades of slate, frost, and silver. Every surface was either cold marble, polished glass, or stiff, unyielding silk. It was a room designed for architectural magazines, not for human resting. I began the process of unbecoming his wife. I did not pack a suitcase. Every designer dress hanging in the walk-in closet, every cashmere sweater folded in the cedar drawers, every pair of imported leather shoes lined up on the illuminated racks. They were not mine. They were expensive costumes, provided by the estate to ensure I looked the part of a billionaire's wife when the cameras flashed. I stripped off the heavy silk robe that draped over my shoulders and let it pool onto the floor like spilled milk. White, flawless, and entirely meaningless. I walked to the far corner of the expansive closet, reaching past the rows of protective plastic garment bags, until my fingers brushed against a small, battered cardboard box pushed into the darkest corner. I pulled it out. Inside were the clothes I had worn on the day I moved into this house. A pair of faded denim jeans, a simple white cotton shirt, and a thick, slightly frayed wool cardigan that still smelled faintly of the small, cramped apartment I used to share with my father. I put them on. The coarse texture of the wool against my bare arms was the first real thing I had felt in 3 years. It wasn't soft, it didn't glide. It scratched and it breathed, and it wrapped around me like a shield. It was entirely mine. Next, I opened my jewelry box. I took out the blue diamond necklace from the night before, alongside the pearl earrings from our first anniversary, the emerald bracelet from his last business trip, and the heavy platinum wedding band that had felt like a shackle since the day he slid it onto my finger. I carried the velvet boxes into Arthur's home office. The room smelled of old paper, leather polish, and the sharp bite of ink. I approached his dark oak desk, the massive centerpiece of his daily operations. With meticulous, surgical precision, I began to organize the returned gifts. I placed the blue diamond box perfectly in the center. To its left, I aligned the pearls. To its right, the emeralds. I adjusted them until the geometry was absolute. The spaces between them measured down to the millimeter. Next to the boxes, I placed the black platinum credit cards he had issued in my name. I stacked them squarely on top of the heavy iron estate keys. I did not want to leave a chaotic, emotional mess for him to scoff at. I wanted to leave him with an eerie, clinical absence. I wanted to turn his own obsession with order and transaction against him. From the top drawer of the desk, I pulled out a fresh sheet of heavy, cream-colored monogrammed paper and a heavy silver fountain pen. The nib scratched against the thick paper, a sharp, decisive sound in the dead silence of the room. I didn't write a love letter. I didn't write a dramatic manifesto of my pain, or a tear-stained plea for him to finally understand how much he had starved me of human warmth. That would have given him too much power. That would have been a negotiation. Instead, I wrote a ledger, in clear, steady handwriting. The same handwriting my mother had taught me at the small kitchen table of my childhood. I cataloged every item I was leaving behind: 1 blue diamond necklace, 1 platinum wedding band, 3 estate keys, 2 black credit cards, 42 garments of clothing. I signed my name at the bottom, not as Clara Vance, but as Clara Harlow. The transaction was complete. The debt was settled. The living security deposit was revoking its own status. I stood up from the heavy desk. Before leaving the room, I reached into the deep pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small, sticky lint roller, one I had quietly taken from the laundry room downstairs. The lint roller made a soft, rhythmic sound as it pulled the fabric of the leather chair. It was a terrifyingly quiet act of rebellion. People who throw things and scream are asking to be heard. They are begging for the other person to engage with their pain. But I was not asking to be heard anymore. I was actively removing my voice from the room. I knelt down, pressing the adhesive against the expensive Persian carpet, lifting away invisible fibers, a stray eyelash, a speck of dust from my shoe. I took the sleeve of my cardigan and meticulously wiped down the edge of the dark oak desk, where my fingerprints might have lingered on the polished wood. I was systematically removing my physical existence from his sanctuary. I was erasing myself from his timeline. By the time I finished, there was not a single stray hair, not a microscopic trace of my skin cells, left behind to prove I had ever sat in that chair or breathed the air in that room. He wanted a flawless, unproblematic environment. I was giving it to him in its most absolute, terrifying form. I walked back to the bedroom for one final item. Resting on my nightstand, entirely out of place amidst the crystal lamps and silver trays, was a small cedarwood carving. It was a rough-hewn bird, whittled by my father, David, during one of his rare moments of peace before the debts consumed him. The wood was worn smooth from years of my thumb tracing its wings. It smelled faintly of pine needles and old workshops. It was my only true possession of sentimental value, the only object in this sprawling empire that money could not replicate. I slipped the cedarwood, carving into the deep pocket of my cardigan. My hand curled around it, finding immediate grounding comfort in its solid shape. I walked down the grand hallway, my worn shoes making no sound against the thick, plush carpets. The temperature in the house felt even colder now, the sterile, climate-controlled air pushing against my lungs like a physical weight. But I didn't look back. I didn't mourn the luxury I was leaving behind. The dripping crystal chandeliers, the imported Renaissance artwork, the perfectly manicured lawns that required a team of 10 gardeners to maintain. They were just the elaborate, suffocating bars of a gilded cage. I was walking away from an empire, and my hands were entirely empty. I reached the heavy mahogany front doors. I turned the brass knob, feeling the weight of the metal give way. The doors swung open, and the cold morning air rushed in, smelling of damp earth and the distant sea. I stepped over the threshold. I had no car, no bank account, and nowhere specific to go. I had only a wooden bird in my pocket and the clothes on my back. But as I walked down the long, private gravel road, the towering iron gates closing with a heavy click behind me, a profound and absolute peace settled over my shoulders. I was unmoored, stepping out into a vast, terrifyingly open world, but I finally belonged entirely to myself. I was already 200 miles away, resting my forehead against the cold, vibrating glass of a northbound train, when Arthur's Blacktown car finally glided to a halt in front of the Vance estate. I did not witness his return with my own eyes. I did not need to. Julius Thorne would later confess the exact granular details of that evening to me, his voice stripped of its usual corporate armor, sounding instead like a man who had survived a quiet, devastating earthquake. Usually, the massive stone house absorbed sound, functioning like a perfectly calibrated vault, meant to isolate its inhabitants from the unpredictability of the outside world. But that evening, Julius said, the silence inside the estate had teeth. It was not the peaceful quiet of a resting home. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a vacuum. Arthur had stepped through the mahogany front doors, expecting the predictable rhythm of his transactional life. He expected the faint, ambient hum of the climate control, the smell of bitter lemon wax, and the quiet assurance that his perfectly acquired wife was sitting in the West Wing, existing exactly where he had placed her. Instead, he found an eerie, clinical absence. Arthur did not call out my name. He was a man who required data before he reacted, so he simply began to walk through the sprawling, shadowed rooms. He moved from the sterile white solarium to the cavernous dining room, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the checkerboard marble floors. There was no trace of me. No book left open on a reading chair, no lingering scent of lavender soap in the hallways. I had spent the morning actively erasing my physical existence from his sanctuary, and the sheer totality of that erasure began to press down on his chest. According to Julius, Arthur finally walked into his home office, the sanctuary permeated with the scent of aged parchment and bitter ink. He approached the imposing hub of his corporate dealings. There, resting in absolute, millimeter-perfect symmetry on the dark oak desk, were the velvet boxes. Arthur stopped entirely. He stood frozen in the dim light of the office, staring at the flawless geometry of the returned gifts. The blue diamond box sat precisely in the center, flanked by the emeralds and the pearls, guarded by the stacked platinum credit cards and the heavy iron estate keys. It was not a chaotic mess. It was not a violent display of a woman throwing a tantrum. It was an organized, professional liquidation. Julius stood silently in the doorway, watching as Arthur slowly reached out and picked up the thick, customized stationery, resting beside the jewelry. He read the ledger. He read the exact inventory of every item I had cataloged, every piece of tangible asset I had surrendered, right down to the 42 garments of clothing. He stared at the signature at the bottom, Clara Harlow, not his wife, not his property. Just a woman who had settled her father's debt and walked out into the freezing snow with absolutely nothing. Arthur lowered the paper. The muscles in his jaw locked so tightly that Julius thought his teeth might shatter. "This is how you pay me back," Arthur muttered, his voice barely a gravelly whisper. In the past, he had treated our marriage as a ledger of debts, a strict mandate for obedience, and a reminder of the financial salvation he had provided. But standing in the hollow quiet of his office, the concept of repayment completely inverted itself. It was no longer a transactional command. It was the breathless shock of a man realizing that his vast, unyielding empire possessed absolutely zero leverage over a woman who refused to be bought. I had paid him back in the only currency he understood, inventory and absence, and the transaction had bankrupted him emotionally. Desperate to regain control, to apply a familiar framework to an incomprehensible loss, Arthur reached into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket. His movements were jerky, uncharacteristically frantic. "Julius," Arthur said, turning toward the doorway. He held out his black titanium card, the ultimate symbol of his limitless power. "Call the firm in Boston. Hire the private investigators. Freeze the accounts. Track the cameras. Find her. Whatever it takes." Julius did not move to take the card. He just looked at his employer, seeing something that Arthur had not yet realized himself. There were no accounts to freeze. I had taken nothing. There was no digital footprint to track, no expensive hotel to locate. Arthur looked down at the black titanium card in his hand. Suddenly, the weight of the metal felt grotesque against his skin. It was the very tool he had used to build his gilded cage, the tool he had used to buy a mute button for my grief, and now it was utterly useless. It was just a cold, dead piece of metal. The card slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering against the polished floorwood like a discarded piece of scrap. A visceral, uncontrollable reaction seized him. The titan forged of frost and iron suddenly turned away from Julius, staggering blindly out of the office and down the hall. He shoved open the door to the attached marble bathroom, surrounded by imported Italian stone, gleaming fixtures, and sterile perfections. Arthur Vance gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, his knuckles turning white, and heaved. A sudden violent wave of physical nausea brought him to his knees on the cold floor. He didn't break a mirror. He didn't scream or tear the room apart. Instead, the untouchable billionaire simply shrank, physically breaking down in the dark, because, for the first time in his life, he had encountered a human M's absence that could not be invoiced. While Arthur was suffocating in the vacuum of his own wealth, I was stepping off a rusted, groaning bus onto the cracked pavement of a small forgotten fishing village in coastal Maine. The air here did not smell of lemon wax or chilled silver. It smelled violently of salt, rotting seaweed, damp pine, and absolute freedom. I stood on the side of the narrow, winding coastal road, pulling my frayed wool cardigan tightly around my chest as the freezing wind whipped my hair across my face. I had no luggage. I just shoved my frozen hands into my pockets, my right fingers instinctively tracing smooth wings of the cedarwood carving my father had made. I began the long, uphill walk toward the edge of the jagged cliffs. My destination was David Harlow's old cabin. It had been tied up in an endless, bureaucratic probate for years, entirely overlooked by my father's aggressive creditors, because it was deemed a worthless teardown. It wasn't a sanctuary meant for architectural magazines. It was a weathered, gray-shingled box clinging stubbornly to the rocky coastline, looking as though the next heavy winter storm might finally push it over the edge into the churning Atlantic. But it was in my name. It was mine. As I crested the steep dirt driveway, my breath pluming in the freezing air, I saw a figure waiting on the sagging wooden porch. It was Martha Higgins. She was a woman built like the coastline itself, sturdy, weathered, and entirely unbothered by the cold. She was wrapped in a thick, hand-knit wool shawl that smelled of wood smoke and old rain. She had been my father's closest neighbor, living a half-mile down the dirt road, and she was the one who had kept an eye on the rotting structure while the lawyers fought over the scraps of our old life. Martha did not ask why I was arriving on foot in the dead of winter. She did not ask why the wife of a billionaire was wearing faded denim and a worn sweater. She simply walked down the creaking wooden steps, her boots crunching on the frozen earth, and held out her rough, calloused hand. In her palm rested a heavy, rusted iron key and a dented chamomile tin. "I turned the water on at the main valve this morning," Martha said, her voice a warm, raspy drawl that immediately settled the frantic beating of my heart. "And I brought you something warm for the kettle. It's colder than a well-digger's boots inside, Clara." I took the key and the tin, my fingers brushing against hers. The rough texture of her skin was the most comforting thing I had felt in 3 years. "Thank you, Martha. I didn't know if the place would still be standing." Martha offered a small, quiet smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Some places don't wait to be found, they call to you in silence. She turned and began the long walk, back down the dirt road toward her own property, leaving me entirely alone with the looming structure of my past. I climbed the porch steps, the wood groaning loudly under my weight, and slid the heavy iron key into the rusted lock. It took a hard, two-handed shove to force the door open. The interior of the cabin exhaled a breath of stale, freezing air. It smelled heavily of dust, damp earth, and ancient pine. The floorboards were warped. The windows were clouded with years of sea salt, and a thick layer of grime coated the small, cramped kitchen counters. There were no climate controls. There were no maids moving like shadows to correct the imperfections. There was just raw, unforgiving reality. I walked to the center of the main room, dropping my arms to my sides. I didn't sit down to rest. I didn't allow myself to hesitate. I found an old broom leaning in the corner of the kitchen, its bristles stiff and bent, and I immediately went to work. The physical labor was grueling. I tied my hair back with a frayed piece of string I found on a windowsill and began to sweep the years of accumulated neglect from the floor. Dust danced in the pale gray light, filtering through the dirty glass. I found a bucket beneath the rusted kitchen sink, filled it with freezing, sputtering well water, and grabbed a block of harsh lye soap left behind in a cabinet. I dropped to my hands and knees on the hard wood. I plunged my bare hands into the freezing bucket, the icy water sending a sharp, agonizing shock up my arms, and I began to scrub. I pushed the coarse drag against the warped planks with every ounce of strength in my shoulders. I scrubbed until my knuckles turned raw and bright red. I wanted to scrub away the scent of the Vance estate. I wanted to scrub away the memory of that sprawling antique dining table, the perfectly synthetic lilies, the azure gems that felt like chains. I scrubbed until my breath came in heavy, ragged gasps, the physical exertion finally warming my freezing blood. I was pressing my weight hard against a particularly stubborn stain near the hearth when it happened. A sharp, jagged sliver of old, rotting pine snapped under the pressure of the rag and drove itself deep into the fleshy base of my palm. I gasped, sitting back on my heels and dropping the Sophie rag back into the gray water. I held my hand up in the pale light. A thick, dark wooden splinter was embedded deeply in my skin, and a bright bead of crimson blood was already welling up around the entry point, sliding slowly down my wrist. At the Vance estate, an injury like this would have triggered a clinical protocol. Julius would have been summoned silently. A private physician would have been called to administer antiseptic in a sterile room, ensuring that the prized human asset remained unblemished. But here, in the drafty, rotting cabin, there was no protocol. There was only the wind howling against the thin glass, the steady, rhythmic dripping of the kitchen faucet, and me. I reached over with my left hand, pinched the end of the jagged wood between my fingernails, and pulled it out in one swift, brutal motion. The sting was incredibly sharp. It was a hot, agonizing flare of localized pain that shot up my forearm. I looked at the blood dripping onto the damp, clean floorboards. I didn't cry. Instead, a strange, bubbling sensation rose in the center of my chest. It climbed up my throat, fighting past 3 years of conditioned silence, until it broke free in the empty room. I laughed. It started as a quiet, breathless chuckle, and then it blossomed into a genuine, echoing laugh that bounced off the drafty wooden walls. I sat on my aching knees, holding my bleeding, stinging hand, and I smiled until my face hurt. It was a sharp, magnificent pain, and it belonged entirely to me. It wasn't a metaphorical ache inflicted by a man who couldn't bear to look at me. It wasn't a calculated transaction. It was real. It was tangible. I was alive, and the body that was bleeding was mine to command. I stood up, wrapping a torn piece of paper towel tightly around my palm to stop the bleeding. I walked over to the rusted stove and placed the heavy cast-iron kettle over a struggling blue gas flame. While I waited for the water to boil, I reached into the deep pocket of my cardigan. I pulled out the small cedarwood carving and set it gently on the sill of the cleanest window, letting the small wooden bird look out over the churning gray Atlantic Ocean. When the heavy metal pot finally began to whistle, a harsh, unrefined sound that pierced the quiet of the cabin, I poured the boiling water into a chipped ceramic mug and added a pinch of leaves from Martha's chamomile tin. I sat down on the bare, freshly scrubbed wooden floor, my back leaning against the cold wall. I held the chipped mug in both of my bruised, raw hands, letting the fragrant steam rise and warm my freezing face. I had no bank account. I had no security. I had a splinter in my hand, aching knees, and a house that was slowly losing a war against the ocean wind. I had absolutely nothing, and I had never been more secure. That profound sense of security was not a fleeting emotion. It became the quiet, unshakable foundation of my new existence over the next 60 days. The transition from the purified, temperature-regulated perfection of the Vance estate to the wind-battered reality of the coastal Maine cabin was not a cinematic montage of effortless healing. It was unrelenting physical endurance, and I welcomed every second of it. Every morning required me to carry a rusted iron axe into the dense tree line, swinging it against damp pine logs until my palms grew calloused and sore, the repetitive motion clearing my head of the estate's sterile echoes. Every evening required me to seal the drafty, salt-stained windows with old cotton rags, fighting a daily war to keep the freezing ocean wind from slicing through the single room. But as the weeks bled into one another, the deep blister on my right hand, the splinter I had pulled out on my first day, healed into thick, permanent skin. The physical toll was a grounding anchor. At the estate in Massachusetts, my pain had been invisible, an internal suffocation wrapped in heavy silk and blue diamonds. Here my pain was tangible. It was sore muscles, tired knees, and lungs burning with cold air. It belonged entirely to me. I spent my early mornings sitting by the rusted cast iron wood stove, holding my basic earthenware cup filled with boiling water and a pinch of dried chamomile. The scent of the herbs mixed with the sharp, clean tang of the sea air, creating a perfume that no department store could ever replicate. I would sit on the bare floorboards, listening to the heavy, churning crash of the gray ocean against the jagged cliffs. I was no longer a curated object existing in a vacuum. I was a woman who smelled of wood smoke, sea salt, and sweat. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The fragile peace of my new world shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky above the peninsula had darkened into a deep, heavy violet, the barometric pressure dropping sharply to signal the rapid approach of a coastal storm. I was standing on the sagging wooden porch, stacking the last of my split pine logs against the outer wall, when an unnatural sound breached my sanctuary. It was a low, aggressive, and highly calibrated hum. It was the sound of a machine that did not belong in the wilderness. I stopped, the rough bark of a heavy log pressing sharply into my bare forearms. A sleek black town car was crawling agonizingly slowly up the steep, potholed dirt driveway. The vehicle looked entirely foreign against the wild backdrop of jagged rocks, dying seagrass, and gray mud. It was an armored luxury machine designed to glide over perfectly paved corporate avenues, and now its pristine tires were sinking deep into the unforgiving, freezing Maine earth. The engine idled, emitting a low, vibrating growl that felt like a threat in the quiet landscape. I watched the exhaust curl into the frigid air, a stark reminder of the world I had so meticulously stripped away from my existence. The driver's side door remained firmly shut, but the rear passenger door swung open, fighting against the sudden harsh gusts of the incoming wind. Arthur stepped out into the biting cold. I had not seen my husband in 2 months. The man standing at the edge of my ruined driveway was technically the same billionaire who had purchased my compliance to save my father, but he looked like a hollowed-out, exhausted phantom. He was wearing a dark, charcoal bespoke wool suit, the fabric crisp and impeccably tailored, entirely inappropriate for a freezing coastal squall, but the imposing armor of his extreme wealth could not hide the profound devastation etched deeply into the sharp, aristocratic angles of his face. His gray eyes, which had always been as flat and impenetrable as winter stone, were wide, bloodshot, and entirely unmoored. He walked toward the wooden porch, his $10,000 Italian leather shoes instantly sinking an inch into the wet mud. He didn't seem to notice the destruction of his pristine appearance. He stopped at the bottom of the creaking wooden steps, looking up at me. I did not move. I did not invite him out of the biting wind. I just stood there, holding a piece of split pine to my chest, my battered knit sweater pulled tight around my shivering shoulders. "Clara," Arthur said. His voice, which had once resonated with absolute authority of a corporate titan, cracked on the second syllable of my name. It was a raw, jagged sound, entirely devoid of its usual metallic polish. I placed the piece of pine onto the woodpile and wiped my dirty hands on the thighs of my old pants. You shouldn't have come here, Arthur. There is nothing left to audit. The ledger is closed. He flinched, his shoulders jerking as if the words had struck him physically. He reached into the interior pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. My breath hitched out of pure instinct, anticipating another velvet box. Another flawless piece of jewelry meant to act as a financial mute button for my emotions. Instead, he pulled out a massive, thick legal folder, made of heavy, cream-colored cardstock. I didn't come to audit you, Arthur said, his breath pluming in the freezing air, his words rushing out in a frantic clinical cadence. He took a hesitant step up the wooden porch, holding the thick folder out toward me like a desperate paper shield. Julius prepared this. I spent the last 3 weeks tracking the ownership of this entire peninsula. The town, the acreage surrounding this cabin, the access roads, the shoreline. I bought it, all of it. I stared at him, my heart beating a slow, sorrowful rhythm against my ribs. The cabin is structurally unsafe, he continued, pointing a trembling finger at the rotting gray shingles. The foundation is sinking into the cliff. The nearest trauma center is 40 miles away down a logging road. You are entirely exposed here. It isn't secure, so I brought the deed. I can have a commercial construction team here by dawn tomorrow. We can build a proper, fortified estate. We can secure the perimeter. I can make it safe for you, Clara. You don't have to freeze. You don't have to live in the dirt. I looked at the man shivering on my steps. He was trying to buy the village. He was trying to purchase a 50-mile radius of the coast just to place a controlled, climate-regulated bubble over my existence. This was the only vocabulary he possessed. He did not know how to bridge the emotional distance between us, so he sought to control the physical distance instead. When faced with the terrifying reality of human fragility, the cold billionaire simply threw millions of dollars at the earth until it bent to his exact specifications. He could not say he was terrified of losing me, so he brought a legal contract to secure a perimeter. I looked at the thick, cream-colored folder in his trembling hand. It represented a staggering fortune. It represented a lifetime of absolute financial immunity, an instant escape from the physical labor that was testing my endurance. I reached out and gently took the folder from his freezing fingers. Relief washed over his pale face for a fraction of a second. He exhaled a shaky breath, clearly assuming the transaction had been accepted, assuming his purchased wife was finally returning to the safety of the vault. I didn't say a single word. I turned my back to him, pushed open the heavy front door, and walked into the dim center of the cabin. Arthur followed me immediately, stopping just inside the threshold, his ruined leather shoes seeping dark mud onto the floorboards I had scrubbed raw on my hands and knees. I walked directly to the rusted wood stove. The fire inside had dwindled to a few glowing, desperate red embers, struggling uselessly to combat the plunging temperature of the drafty room. I unlatched the heavy cast-iron door. A faint wave of residual heat licked at my cold cheeks. Slowly and with deliberate precision, I opened the cream-colored folder. I pulled out the massive real estate deed to the coastal village, the 50-page legal document that gave me absolute dominion over the earth beneath my feet. I rolled the thick, expensive, watermarked paper into a tight cylinder. "Clara," Arthur whispered, profound confusion bleeding into his gravelly voice. I shoved the rolled deed directly into the dying embers of the stove. I watched as the heat licked at the edges of the paper. The thick paper resisted for a moment, smoking heavily, and then the edges curled, blackened, and burst into a bright, consuming flame. The fire fed hungrily on the dense legal jargon, on the authorized signatures, on the millions of dollars of leveraged corporate power. The sudden burst of light flickered across the drafty room, casting warm shadows against the rotting walls. I took the empty ivory dossier and casually tossed it in after the deed, closing the iron door with a heavy, final clang. I turned back to him. Arthur was staring at the rusted stove, his face completely bloodless, his gray eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. The absolute lack of temptation, the casual, unbothered way I had treated his massive wealth as literal trash, to keep myself warm, had completely and utterly disarmed his corporate mind. "I didn't need your diamonds, Arthur," I said quietly, the silence between us, feeling heavier than the churning ocean outside. "And I don't need your real estate. The only thing I ever needed from you was a partner, but you don't know how to be a person. You only know how to be a bank." He stood frozen in the entryway, the reality of the burning paper severing the very last tether he believed he had on my life. His empire was turning to ash inside a rusted iron box, providing me with 5 minutes of temporary heat. "I don't know how else to fix this," he said, the words barely a breath, his imposing frame seeming to shrink under the weight of the realization. "You can't buy a fix for this," I replied, walking back toward the door. I picked up my basic earthenware cup from the scarred wooden counter and held it in both hands, letting the residual warmth seep into my calloused palms. "You need to leave. A heavy storm is coming, and your car will get stuck in the mud on the dirt road." I stepped around his frozen form, placing my hand firmly on the brass knob of the heavy wooden door. I looked up at him, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with a profound, melancholic pity. "Go home, Arthur." He didn't move. He looked down at me with a desperate, wide-eyed panic. I gently placed my free hand flat against his chest, feeling the fine, expensive weave of his charcoal wool suit, and pushed him backward. He offered absolutely no physical resistance. He was completely hollowed out. He stumbled backward over the threshold, his muddy boots landing heavily on the wet planks of the wooden porch. I closed the door in his face. The rusted iron latch clicked into place with a heavy, definitive snap. I leaned my forehead against the rough, splintered wood of the door, closing my eyes as I listened to the erratic beating of my own heart, half expecting him to hammer his fists against the barrier between us. The storm did not wait for him to retreat. Within 10 minutes of shutting the door, the main sky ripped wide open, unleashing a freezing, relentless downpour. The rain lashed against the thin, clouded glass of the cabin windows with a sharp ferocity. The wind howled through the tree line, rattling the rotting gray shingles and forcing the drafty walls to groan under the immense atmospheric pressure. I sat down on the floor by the wood stove, the flames now roaring brightly, fueled entirely by the ashes of the destroyed real estate deed. I took a slow sip from my ceramic mug, the bitter, earthy taste of chamomile grounding me in the present moment. I waited in the silence, expecting to hear the low, aggressive growl of the high-performance engine retreating down the driveway. I expected him to retreat to the heated leather seats, to call Julius, and to order his private jet to carry him back to the sterile safety of Massachusetts. 20 minutes passed. The engine never started. I set my mug down on the floorboards and walked to the small front window. I wiped away a thick layer of condensation with the ragged sleeve of my wrap and peered out into the gray churning weather. Arthur was still there. He had not retreated to the safety of the luxury car. He had not sought shelter under the meager, zigzagging overhang of the porch roof. He was standing dead center on the muddy dirt path, facing the cabin, fully exposed to the brutal, freezing downpour. The $10,000 bespoke wool suit, an armor designed specifically to intimidate boardrooms and Project Power, was entirely defenseless against the raw fury of the coast. The heavy fabric had absorbed the freezing water, turning from dark charcoal to pitch black, dragging his broad shoulders down with its saturated weight. The wind whipped his wet, dark hair across his forehead. The freezing rainwater ran in thick streams down the sharp angles of his face, soaking deep into his expensive white collar, completely ruining the Italian leather of his shoes as they sank inches deep into the coastal mud. He was shivering. Even from behind the clouded glass, I could see the severe, uncontrollable tremors racking his chest. The temperature outside was hovering dangerously close to freezing, and the rain was relentless, beating against his skin without mercy. He looked entirely out of place, a king without his castle, standing in a domain that refused to bow to his wealth. I stood perfectly still by the glass, my breath fogging the pain. Watching him, this was not a manipulative, theatrical gesture. Arthur Vance did not know how to perform for an audience. He was a man who hid his deep-seated trauma and vulnerabilities behind massive boardroom tables and titanium credit cards. For him to stand willingly in the freezing mud, allowing the natural elements to strip away his physical armor, was an act of catastrophic, absolute unraveling. I watched as his body fought a losing battle against the extreme cold. His rigid, unyielding posture, the exact same posture that had commanded thousands of employees and liquidated rival corporations, began to fail him. His broad shoulders slumped forward. His arms hung limply, uselessly at his sides. The freezing rain dripping rapidly from his numb fingertips. He was waiting for a transaction that was never going to happen. He was standing in the storm, waiting for me to yield, to recognize his grand sacrifice, to open the door and save him from the elements. But I had promised myself I would never be the collateral in his life again. I did not move to open the door, and then the internal scaffolding of the man built of winter stone finally collapsed. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic drop. It was a slow, agonizing failure of basic human physiology. The brutal cold had leached the vital heat from his bones, but it was the crushing, localized gravity of his own emotional bankruptcy that finally broke him. His powerful legs simply gave out. Arthur dropped to his knees in the deep freezing mud of the dirt path. The heavy impact sent a thick spray of dark brown water up the ruined fabric of his trousers. He didn't try to catch himself. He didn't brace his fall with his hands to protect his clothes. He simply let the wet earth claim him. He knelt there in the storm, his head bowed heavily toward his chest, the freezing rain beating ruthlessly against his back, surrounded by nothing but rotting pine, the roaring ocean, and a massive silence he could not buy his way out of. He was stripped of his corporate empire. He was stripped of his luxury. He was stripped entirely of his unyielding pride. He was reduced to shivering flesh and blood, kneeling in the dirt, entirely at the mercy of a woman who needed absolutely nothing from him to survive. I stood by the window, my bare hand pressed flat against the freezing glass. I watched the most powerful, emotionally walled man ever known surrender, completely to his own devastation. My heart ached, a deep, resonant pull in the very center of my chest, but I did not immediately run to the door to pull him inside. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits, and sometimes, before a man constructed entirely of emotional ice can learn to exist safely in a warm room, he has to let the freezing rain wash away the very last remnants of his pride. I stepped back from the window, leaving him kneeling in the storm, and quietly went to boil more water. I let the water in the blackened vessel reach a violent, screaming boil before I finally moved from the stove. I did not rush. I knew with a terrifying certainty that if I opened the heavy wooden door too soon, the man kneeling in the freezing mud would still be Arthur Vance, the untouchable corporate titan who merely happened to be caught in a storm. He needed to become something else entirely. He needed to be stripped down to his marrow. He needed to become a man who was simply, profoundly cold, a man who required shelter not as a calculated transaction, but as a desperate human necessity. I walked to the front of the cabin, my worn shoes completely silent against the floorboards. I placed my hand on the rusted iron latch. The metal was freezing to the touch, vibrating with the immense pressure of the coastal wind howling against the exterior walls. I pressed down, pulling the heavy door inward. The storm immediately invaded the quiet sanctuary, throwing a harsh gust of freezing rain and sea salt across my face. Arthur was still there. He was kneeling exactly where I had left him, on the muddy dirt path, his head bowed heavily, his dark, soaked hair plastered against his forehead. When the creak of the door cut through the roar of the downpour, he slowly lifted his head. His gray eyes, which had always mirrored the impenetrable, sterile perfection of his Massachusetts estate, were entirely shattered. They were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of the sharp calculation that usually defined him. He didn't demand to be let in. He didn't offer a newly drafted contract or a promise of financial restitution. He just looked at me, shivering uncontrollably, waiting in the silence for a mercy he knew he could not buy. I stepped back, leaving the doorway open. It was a silent invitation, a physical threshold he had to choose to cross on his own terms. It took him a long moment to force his failing limbs to obey. He planted his ruined, mud-caked hands into the freezing earth, pushing his exhausted frame upward. He stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the wet clay, before he finally dragged himself up the creaking wooden steps. He crossed the threshold, stepping into the dim, drafty interior of the cabin, and I pushed the door shut behind him. locking the storm outside. He stood entirely frozen in the center of the main room, a dark, dripping phantom. The bespoke wool suit was completely destroyed, heavy with freezing water and thick brown mud. That was already beginning to pool on the clean floorboards I had scrubbed raw earlier that week. He didn't look at the mess. He didn't criticize the sagging ceiling or the lack of central heating. He just stood there, his broad shoulders shaking violently, his teeth chattering in the sudden quiet stillness of the room. I did not offer him a warm towel or a soft word of comfort. I walked over to the old cedar chest resting beneath the clouded window and threw open the heavy lid. The scent of dried lavender and old pine drifted up as I reached inside, bypassing my own meager belongings, and pulled out a stack of my late father's old clothes. I retrieved a thick, faded red flannel shirt, a pair of worn denim jeans that had seen years of harsh coastal winters, and a pair of heavy, fraying wool socks. I walked back to Arthur and pressed the bundle into his trembling, freezing hands. "Take off the suit," I said quietly, my voice barely carrying over the crackle of the wood stove. "Leave it by the door, put these on." He didn't argue. He didn't point out the indignity of wearing my late father's threadbare clothing. He simply nodded, his numbers struggling clumsily with the expensive, imported buttons of his jacket. I turned my back to give him privacy, listening to the heavy, wet thud of the ruined charcoal fabric hitting the floorboards, followed by the quiet rustle of coarse denim. When I finally turned back around, the billionaire was gone. Standing in his place was a man who looked entirely ordinary. The sleeves of the flannel shirt were slightly too short, exposing his pale wrists, and the jeans hung awkwardly on his large frame. He looked incredibly vulnerable. He looked like a person. The night passed in an uneasy, heavy silence. I gave him the small, lumpy sofa near the stove, draping a single, scratchy wool blanket over his shivering shoulders, while I retreated to my narrow cot in the corner. He did not complain about the metal springs pressing into his back. He did not mention the draft slipping through the window frames. He just lay there in the dark, watching the red embers of the fire slowly burn down to ash. By dawn, the brutal coastal storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron and a biting, absolute cold that seemed to crack the very air. When the pale gray light crept into the cabin, I handed Arthur the rusted iron firewood axe. The wooden handle was heavily splintered, bound together in two places by old fraying electrical tape. The metal blade was dull, scarred by years of striking coastal rocks beneath the chopping block. "If you want to stay here, you contribute," I told him, my voice completely devoid of malice, but equally devoid of pity. "There are no construction teams to call. There is no Julius to manage the logistics. You do it. We need wood, or we freeze tonight." Arthur looked down at the heavy, ugly tool in his hands. He had spent his entire adult life wielding a silver fountain pen, signing documents that altered the skylines of major cities. He had never engaged in manual labor, but he didn't hesitate. He gave a single, tight nod, pulled the collar of the faded flannel shirt up around his neck, and stepped out onto the freezing, mud-slicked porch. I watched him walk toward the dense tree line at the edge of the property, where a massive pile of unsplit, damp pine logs lay waiting in the frost. I stood by the clouded kitchen window, a warm ceramic mug held tightly between my palms, and I watched him fight an impossible battle. Arthur placed a thick, wet pine log onto the scarred wooden chopping block. He adjusted his stance, his polished corporate posture completely useless in the uneven, freezing mud. He raised the heavy iron axe high above his head and brought it down with a forceful, uncoordinated swing. The dull blade struck the dense, wet wood at a bad angle and bounced off violently, the brutal recoil sending a visible jarring shock straight up his arms. Arthur stumbled backward, dropping the axe into the dirt, his face twisting in sudden, sharp pain. He stood there for a long moment, his breath pluming in white clouds around his face, staring down at the defiant piece of timber. He possessed a sleek, black smartphone in the pocket of his ruined suit jacket hanging by the door. He could easily walk inside, make a single 30-second phone call to a local supplier, and have a cord of perfectly split, kiln-dried wood delivered to the cabin within the hour. He could throw money at the discomfort, just as he had always done, mitigating the physical toll with his vast financial leverage. Instead, he bent down, wrapped his freezing fingers around the splintered handle, picked up the axe from the mud, and approached the block again. For 3 agonizing hours, I stood by the window and watched the most powerful man I knew willingly humiliate himself. He swung, and he missed. He swung, and the blade became hopelessly lodged in the wet pine, forcing him to wrestle and kick at the heavy log until it finally came free. His form was terrible, a jagged display of stubborn, desperate exertion. Slowly, the friction of the splintered wooden handle began to tear at the soft, uncalloused skin of his palms. I could see the exact moment the blisters formed, and I saw the moment they inevitably burst. Bright crimson streaks of blood began to smear across the pale wood of the axe handle, but he did not stop. He wiped his bleeding hands against the thighs of his borrowed trousers and kept swinging. His muscles screamed with the unaccustomed labor, his chest heaving as sweat mixed with the freezing coastal air, but he refused to quit. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. Standing there, watching him bleed for a fire he was trying to build for me, I realized that Arthur was finally speaking my language. He was not trying to buy a perimeter to keep the world away. He was tearing his own hands apart to keep the cold out. It was late afternoon when the heavy wooden door finally pushed open. Arthur stumbled over the threshold, his breathing ragged and shallow. He carried only 4 jagged, unevenly chopped pieces of pine, a meager, pathetic yield for hours of agonizing labor, but he held them against his chest as if they were bars of solid gold. He walked to the rusted iron stove, knelt down, and carefully deposited the wood into the metal bin as if arranging fragile glass. He didn't look at me. He was exhausted, his broad shoulders slumping heavily, shivering from the sweat cooling against his skin, and he smelled strongly of pine sap, wet earth, and raw, unfiltered effort. I walked over to the wooden chair by the table and pulled it out. "Sit," I said softly. He collapsed into the chair, letting his heavy arms fall dead against his thighs, his chest heaving with slow, ragged breaths. I went to the rusted sink, filling a small tin basin with warm water from the kettle, making sure the temperature was soothing but not scalding. I gathered a rough cotton towel and the harsh block of lye soap, carrying them over to the table. I knelt on the bare floorboards in front of him and gently took his right hand into both of mine. His palm was a ruined landscape of torn skin, deep splinters, and raw, bleeding blisters. The fingers that had once traced the geometric facets of a blue diamond necklace were now trembling violently from sheer muscular exhaustion. I dipped the rough cloth into the warm water and carefully pressed it against his cuts. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth, his jaw locking in pain. "Tell me to stop," I whispered, my voice hovering in the quiet space between us. He shook his head slowly, refusing to pull away. "No," he rasped, his eyes finding mine. "Don't stop." I washed the blood and the dirt from his hands, the water in the tin basin, slowly turning a pale, hazy pink. The silence stretching between us was no longer the heavy, suffocating vacuum of the Massachusetts estate. It was a profound, breathing peace. He looked down at my hands, tending to his wounds. He didn't offer a grand apology. He didn't demand forgiveness. He simply let me care for him, dropping the last heavy shield of his pride onto the floor. A sudden, sharp knock at the door broke the quiet intimacy of the room. I stood up, wiping my wet hands on my cardigan, and opened the door. Martha Higgins stood on the sagging wooden porch, wrapped in her thick wool shawl. She held a woven basket, containing a half-dozen fresh eggs and a loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper. Her sharp, weathered eyes immediately swept past me, landing on the billionaire, sitting in the kitchen chair, wearing my father's plaid shirt and bleeding onto a cotton towel. Martha didn't ask questions. She simply held out the basket. "Figured the 2 of you might need some provisions before the roads freeze over completely tonight," she rasped. Before I could reach for the basket, I heard the heavy scrape of the wooden chair against the floorboards. Arthur stood up, walking slowly toward the doorway. He reached past me, pulling his ruined charcoal suit jacket from the iron peg on the wall. He reached into the interior pocket and withdrew his sleek black smartphone. The absolute center of his global empire, his direct line to Julius, his endless accounts, and his corporate control. Arthur held the device out to Martha. "Take this," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, completely stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "Keep it at your house for the week, please." Martha looked at the expensive piece of technology, then looked up into Arthur's exhausted, bloodshot eyes. She understood exactly what the gesture meant. She nodded slowly, taking the phone, and dropping it carelessly into the deep pocket of her heavy wool coat. She handed me the basket of food, offered a short, approving nod, and turned to walk back out into the freezing wind. Arthur had voluntarily severed the last tether to his empire. He had willingly locked himself inside a decaying, drafty cabin, choosing the terrifying silence of our shared reality over the sterile safety of his wealth. Evening settled deeply over the rugged coastline, plunging the world outside into a vast, impenetrable blackness. The cabin was lit only by the warm, flickering orange glow of the wood stove, fueled entirely by the jagged pieces of pine Arthur had bled to chop. I walked to the small wooden cabinet above the sink. I bypassed the worn clay mug I usually used and reached into the very back, pulling out 2 small, hand-carved wooden cups. My father had whittled them on this very porch decades ago, carving intricate, winding vines into the smooth cedar. They were rustic, imperfect, and utterly irreplaceable. I placed a heavy pinch of dried chamomile flowers into each cup and poured the boiling water over them. The steam rose instantly, filling the small, confined space with the rich, grounding scent of earthy flowers, wet wood, and deep nostalgia. I carried the cups to the hearth, sitting down on the bare floorboards beside Arthur. I handed him one of the wooden cups. He took it carefully, wincing slightly as the hot wood pressed against his bandaged palms, but he held onto it tightly, letting the heat seep into his shivering bones. We sat shoulder to shoulder, staring into the bright, shifting flames behind the iron grate. "I don't know how to do this," Arthur whispered into the quiet space, his gaze fixed on the fire. It was the first time in his life he had ever admitted to not knowing the answer, the first time he had ever confessed his own profound inadequacy, without trying to buy a solution. "You're doing it," I replied softly, taking a slow sip of the hot, bitter tea. He didn't offer a new contract. He didn't promise to buy me a different cabin or upgrade the rusted stove. He just brought the wooden cup to his lips and drank the tea I had made for him. The man who had once demanded absolute, clinical perfection was now perfectly content to sit on a hard, dusty floor, wearing someone else's old clothes, warming his bleeding hands on a cup of cheap herbal tea. I looked at the firelight dancing across the sharp, exhausted angles of his face, and I felt the last, heavy remnants of my own defensive armor dissolve into the warm air. We had not magically erased the past, but we had finally leveled the ground beneath our feet. I had returned his diamonds, and in exchange he had given me his absolute, unshielded humanity. As I leaned my head gently against his broad shoulder, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the coarse flannel, I finally understood the truth. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for sitting with us in the silence, and until next time, keep your sanctuary warm.